In part 2 of the DIY USB power brick build, I had just finished creating the ventilation holes for the power supply, so now it's time to organise the wiring for the USB ports. First up, I need to extend the length of the USB-C cables. So I cut 4 lengths of red wire and 4 of black wire and stripped the ends. The connectors that came on the end of the USB-C ports need to be chopped off, and also the ends need to be stripped. I solder all of these together and then cover the exposed wire with heat shrink and job's done. All of these wires will be connected to these power distribution blocks, and they came with these ring terminals. The next step is to solder all the ring terminals to the wires. I don't need to put heat shrink on these, as I only stripped enough wire to fit in the connector and the end has a protective sheath. For the USB-A ports, they have an outer shielding sheath which leaves only a small length of the inner red and black wires exposed. I need more length on these inner wires, so I tried here to strip it off, but the problem is that my knife can too easily cut into the inner wires and expose the strands. You can see them poking through here. With that in mind, I'm going to cut these cables shorter and replace them with lengths of separate red and black wires. That means for all of the 8 USB-A ports, I need to cut the lengths, solder them together, put on the heat shrink, and then solder the ring terminals. Next up is to wire up the connectors for the IEC 320 power socket. I've got a small length of 3-core flex left over from the router table build, and it's the perfect length I need here. After stripping the wires and soldering on the connectors, I'm using clear heat shrink as the inner cores are color coded for active, neutral and ground. On the other end, I need to use fork connectors that will connect to the power supply terminals. So after soldering these terminals, I decided to cover the active wire with clear heat shrink, neutral wire with blue heat shrink, and the earth wire with green-yellow heat shrink, just because I want it to be clearly visible at the power supply. With all of the soldering completed, it's now time to glue the recessed box section to the larger box piece. I've got this piece clamped to the table, and after applying some glue, I've clamped it in place and leave it to dry. After a few hours, it's looking good. Here you can see the USB-C ports, bottom USB-A ports, and the inner plug are all in place and looking nice. I'm going to wire up everything I can now before doing any more gluing. So after mounting the power supply, I connect the input power to the power supply and see what the power distributions look like. I originally intended to have one of these on the lid, however with them sitting here I'm happy there is enough room to fit everything in. So I do a couple of measurements, mark some alignment lines and then screw these in place, and they are not going anywhere. Now it's time to connect all of these USB cables to the power distribution blocks. There are 16 wires at the moment, and when I glue the side panels on, I'll connect the remaining 8 wires from the side USB-A ports. It doesn't take too long to do this, and it's really starting to take shape. The next step is to connect the power distribution blocks to the power supply. I have some heavier gauge cable for this and some larger ring terminals. For these, I'm not going to be soldering, but crimping them instead, as the larger cable allows for a more secure crimp. Well, that's my personal opinion anyways. Once I crimp the ring terminal, I connect it to the power supply so I can determine how long I need to make it and then give it the chop, removing it afterwards so I can complete crimping it on the other end. I follow this up with some heat shrink on both ends of the cable, and now it's time to install it permanently. The power distribution block came with this rubber cover for the lead and ring terminal, so with that installed and the bolt done up, it looks very nice. I repeat the same steps here for the red cable, and with all of this in place, it's looking somewhat close to being finished. Almost like I could test it out and see if it works. So let's do just that. I connect my input power cable and turn it on. You can see the main switch lights up, and there's also an LED on the power supply to indicate that it's receiving power. I've got my USB light there in the bottom left corner, and so I connect it to one of the bottom USB-A ports, and it turns on as expected. Awesome stuff indeed. I did notice that the internal fan on the power supply came on as soon as I turned on the USB light. So it's triggered by a load on the 5-volt rail and not temperature levels. It'll be interesting to see how much I can hear this once the box is fully enclosed. I'm now ready to start the final gluing of the box, and I need to give the side panels a sanding before proceeding. However, before I do this, I need to drill some pilot holes to the mounting plates and screw them in. I'll unscrew them now so I don't get them dusty, and just before I glue the panels in, I'll screw them in. Make sure you remind me to do that so I don't forget. I give these two panels a good sanding with 180 and 240 grit before blasting them with the air compressor. Excuse the brightness as this time of day the sun comes in hard and I need the door open for the dust to go somewhere. Great, now it's time to glue the first side up. So on with some glue and then clamping the panel down in place, and it's looking pretty good. And yeah, I know the edge isn't sitting flush, but this is a pretty basic box and some of the wood has bowed since I milled it. But it is functional. Now with that done, I'll leave it to sit and dry for a few hours. Until about a minute later, I remembered that I forgot to mount the USB ports before gluing. Luckily I remembered when I did, as the glue had almost taken hold. I mean, I would have been able to mount it in, it just would have been difficult to get those screws in with all the cables in the way. Anyways, with the ports mounted, I re-glued it and clamped it in place, leaving it to dry. After waiting a few hours, I come back to glue the other panel on, but this time I didn't forget to mount the USB ports first. After that, I lay some glue down, put the panel in place and clamp it down. I'm not going to glue in the end panel right now, so I'm putting some greaseproof paper in the corner to stop the end piece from sticking. I put a couple of other clamps in place just to make sure everything is set in position and then leave it to dry. When I come back later, you can see here with the top panel resting in place how there is a gap between the power supply and the panel. You can also see how the air vents line up. This turned out quite nice. So now it's time to glue in the top panel to complete the box. Throw a few clamps on it and we're almost done. While the glue is drying, I'm going to wire up those remaining 4 USB ports from the side panels and then double check that all the screws are done up firm, and that finishes off all the wiring. Now that the glue has dried, it's really taken shape. All that remains now is to put the lid on, and Robert's your mother's brother. I'm going to be screwing the lid in place as it may need to be serviced in the future. So I clamp the lid in place and then mark out where all the screw holes need to go. I drill all the pilot holes first, and once that's done I go over all the holes with my hand drill and a countersunk bit. After that I put the screws in, and some of them need some more countersinking, but before too long it's all done. I finally have my DIY USB power brick ready for my craft table. It fits perfectly in place, looks like my initial measurements were accurate. It's anchored in place at the top with a single 25mm half saddle. That's just to stop it from moving if I bumped it. I'm not going to apply a finish to it. Being an inside box, it doesn't need to be protected from the weather. Also, I'm interested in seeing what happens to unfinished wood over time when it's inside. Now the big question is, has it fixed my original problem where my USB LED lights were dimming when the old power pack thermal limited itself? Well, here's the temperature of the fan output a couple of minutes after I turned it on with all 6 lights running, a cool 34.2 degrees Celsius. I left them powered on for 2 hours and they never dimmed, and the temperature is now 37.8 degrees. That's much better than the 59 degrees I was hitting with my old USB power pack. So I'm very happy with my DIY USB power brick using components I bought on AliExpress. I'm also super keen to get back to some projects on the craft bench I've been putting off. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, bye!